Renegade Scavengers, an idea I had for a kill team that didn't come into fruition until much later in the project, and it all started off by me grabbing a few Space Marines I had laying around and trying out a few different ideas that I thought could create a really interesting project, mainly using some Chaos Space Marine parts on a Primaris model. But as I was still quite uncertain if I want to go with this idea, I decided to try out some different arms using some white tack, which to my surprise was a fantastic idea, as I didn't have to visualize the model in my head. I could just assemble it and see what the model would actually look like, which is very helpful, especially when you're trying out some different ideas that you are uncertain about. And after creating this rough draft, I definitely enjoyed the idea of using the Chaos parts. However, I didn't just want to call them Chaos Space Marines with Primaris bodies, so I wanted to try to create some sort of an idea for how it could make sense. And while I was gluing all the parts together, I decided to think specifically about that. These Primaris were sent as reinforcements to a second founding chapter on the edge of the galaxy. When they arrived to their chapter, they found out only ruins and destruction, and an orbital beacon saying that this planet was wiped out by the Inquisition due to the fact that it was found to contain heretical Space Marines. These Space Marines knew well enough that if they reported back to the Imperium, they most likely would be marked as heretics themselves. Instead, they decided to become renegades, trading with rogue traders and different factions to survive in the best way they can. As a result of their armor suffering damage beyond repairs, they had to succumb to the ways of the scavenger, finding whatever they can to repair their armor and doing their best to stay alive. At the time, I didn't expect to make this into a full kill team, and I just focused on making these two units. For the first one, even though I'm using a Phobos armor, I'm imagining this is actually an Assault Intercessor, who happens to enjoy a more tactical and agile way, which is why he's employing a slightly lighter armor. To reflect that visually, I decided to give him this really interesting base where he's jumping off of this plate of this corrupted Death Guard. When I went to attach him to the base, I decided to use some sprue goo, and when I was attaching him, I accidentally moved his arm a little bit, which was when I decided to actually re-angle it a little bit and give it a bit more of an interesting pose. Using sprue goo is definitely the furthest from the perfect solution for this, and in the long run, it was probably much more difficult than using something, like, for example, as like using a pin. However, I just found it much more simple at the time, and in the end, it actually worked out pretty well. For the head, even though I wanted to use this Reaver head, I decided to rip it off and instead give him something much more interesting and something that will match the Scavenger much more, which is a classical beaky helmet, because beakies are awesome and you can never go wrong with one. Personally, I think the combination of a Phobos armor and a beaky helmet is just a match made in heaven. And with that, the first member of the kill team was done, and I decided to name this guy Quill because it just felt like an interesting name. For this next Space Marine, I decided to try some arms that I've been experimenting for quite some time and just trying to find a way where I could actually use them. And this is probably the closest use I found for them. However, in the long run, I decided to go against it as I couldn't find any equipment that would match this in the kill team. For those wondering, that is indeed a Votan arm, and even though those guys are really tiny, for some reason it actually looks kind of cool in a Space Marine, even though Primaris are just massive compared to them. But to match an equipment of an Assault Intercessor, I decided to give him something similar to the previous one and go for this arm from a Death Guard as well as this chainsword from a Chaos Space Marine. And it gave him a very interesting and heavy pose, as if he's walking with this incredibly heavy bolter in his one hand. But to make sure that I removed some of the Nurgle parts, I decided to take them off and try to scrape off some of the pieces that were a little bit on the nose. For example, this incredibly disgusting looking slug or some sort of a parasite that was on this gun. And then scrape the area clean off just to make sure that there weren't really too many damaged areas on there. As well as drilling out the barrel, as this gun was just too thick and it just looked a little bit strange without it. Because I decided to use a push-fit model, it left me with this very strange looking hole that was just not attaching the arm quite well. So I filled it in with some sprue goo and attached the arm much more easily. However, it still required quite a bit of moving around just to find an area where it would fit much easier. For the next arm, I decided to not waste any time and fill it with sprue goo right away, just to ensure the fact that it'll fit on much better. Unfortunately, because I was using so much sprue goo, the arms did slide around quite a bit, so required a lot more posing than usual. And when I started working on his head, it's when I came up with the idea of calling this guy Mr. Bones. I found this additional skull that's been laying on my desk for quite some time, and I decided to try to see if I can make it into a shoulder pad. It felt like it would give this guy a lot more character and make him far more interesting. And it feels quite fitting for someone who's a scavenger. What I didn't expect was the amount of scraping I was gonna have to do. Afterwards, I filled it in with a massive amount of sprue goo. The idea behind it is when I would push it against the shoulder, it would envelop it and create a very secure fit. And for the other shoulder pad, I decided to go with a Chaos Space Marine one similar to the previous one, as at this point it felt like a theme and a really good way to represent that. Unfortunately, in doing that, I ended up moving the skull quite a bit, so I ended up spending several more minutes just trying to find a good position and something that visually fit him. After finding the good position, I decided to fill it in with some additional sprue goo just to ensure that it wouldn't move again. By this point, I was full into the whole idea of this guy being Mr. Bones, so I decided to give him an additional bone piece. I was hoping that attaching this orc jaw would be quite an easy task, however, unfortunately, just as previously, it was just a little bit off. Unfortunately, scraping a portion of his mask off was just not enough to make the jaw fit, so I had to scrape the inside of it too, which was more difficult than I expected. It was a balancing act between trying my best not to crush this piece by accident and trying to use enough force to scrape it off. Once again, I did fill in with some sprue goo just to ensure that this jaw wouldn't accidentally come loose, as it did feel like it was quite finicky. And with that, Mr. Bones, the second member of this kill team, was done. Afterwards, I proceeded to prime them with some Vallejo primer. Now, when it came to the paint job, I wasn't quite certain about what colors I should actually be using for this, mainly because someone is a scavenger doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be rusty and crusty and look like a Nurgle worshiper that just came out of a hole. So instead, I opted to go for a very dark midnight color, using a very desaturated blue and create a texture that represents the fact that their armor is damaged and they aren't in the best of shape, but at the same time, without any obvious rust marks or anything similar to that. To highlight and keep a desaturated color, I simply continued adding a little bit of white to my paint and create this visual of this very sickly looking armor. I'm personally not a big fan of edge highlighting, so I decided to go for something of a mixture between creating a texture with my brush strokes as well as creating a volumetric highlight on the pieces of the armor, using something very similar to stippling but mixing it in with the combination of other things. For the bone, I simply started off by working with this very deep bone color, but it just wasn't really looking good enough, so I decided to go all the way up to white and then come back in with some contrast paints just to give it that very yellowy color that will match very well with the blues of the armor. And after painting all the leather, I decided these guys needed a lot more depth. So I mixed up my favorite acrylic wash and I went in with that. Luckily, it has a very cold hue, so it actually helped out the armor even more and gave it a much more interesting, deeper color. As when I was adding the whites to my highlights, it did desaturate the armor just a little bit more than I wanted to. For the metallics, I went with this very interesting bronze-like color called Burnt Tin from AK. And the warm tones of this metallic mixed up really well with the cold hues of the armor. Afterwards, I used a tiny amount of Vallejo chrome just to highlight some of the areas of the metallic. Afterwards, I ended up using some colors ahead of my palette from painting the armor and started painting his face, using something I've been doing quite a bit, which is create the idea that he's actually having a little bit of stubble on his head and not a perfectly clean bald head. And with that done, I did the final step of applying some additional chrome to the blade, and with that, these guys were finally done. These guys turned out really awesome, and I'm definitely glad that I went for a very simple paint job as it gave them a really grim dark aesthetic that I think matches their background theme. And I already started working on the other 4 members of the skill team. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.